command in Exodus to have no yeast, no leaven. That's how it's written there. No leaven. They didn't have yeast like we have today. No leaven is to be found in your house for 7 days. Now, you ladies, you know this. Maybe some of you have had a thing called starter dough. I remember a few years ago, recipes, they kind of follow through a congregation. Somebody will get a recipe and somebody else will find out about it, and that recipe will go through the congregation, kind of like the flu sometimes. But I remember a few years ago when there was a recipe for fruitcake, because I love fruitcake. And my wife got this recipe, and I remember it called for starter dough in it. I believe I'm right about that. Had a starter in it. And in that day, in the day of the Old Testament, the way they would leaven their bread is they would take a little dough left over from the last batch and save that for the next baking. And that's how they did it, because they didn't have yeast. So that's how they would do that. And so what God said to them was, you have to remove all leaven from your homes. Now somebody says, why in the world would they have to do that? Because leaven represented influence. That's what it represents. It influenced. That's the idea. Of course, you know, you ladies especially know this. Leaven works through the whole batch of dough that you have, and it's influencing that which is around it and all that. So that's what leaven represents. It represents that which is influence. So God says, look, I want to teach you a lesson about how I don't want you to be influenced by Egypt when you leave Egypt. Now, that's what he's saying. That's the original intent of it. You're not to be influenced by Egypt, by Egyptian culture. So to symbolize that, I want you to put aside all the leaven in your house, all the influence of this bread in your house, which represents that you're putting away all these Egyptian gods and all this Egyptian influence. And when you leave Egypt, you're going to leave Egypt behind. There's going to be a clean break, and there's not going to be anything remaining of Egypt. And so that's what all that's supposed to symbolize. Now, if you want to look there while I'm talking here, you can look over in Exodus 12, verse 18 through 20. He talks about this. Now, the way it worked, the way they began their celebration is that the father of the house was to go through the house, and they still do this today. It's to go through the house and remove all the leaven in the house. Once all the leaven is removed from the house, they actually start the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And that's how it all kicks off, and that's how it all begins with that. And that goes on for 7 days. Now, following, or rather what happens is once the leaven is removed, you start the Passover. And that's when you have the Passover meal. The Passover meal was unleavened bread. And so they did that. Now, TJ, do we have a screen up yet? Okay. Don't have that up yet? All right. Somebody, if you don't mind, maybe I can do that right here myself. I'm going to turn over to the book of Mark. Mark's parallel account here. And look at chapter 15 for just a second here. Mark chapter 15 and verse 42. He says, referring to this, all this happened on Friday, the day of preparation, the day before the Sabbath, as evening approached. So now, Mark doesn't just tell us it's the Feast of Unleavened Bread or the Passover. He tells us what day it is. Now, in the Old Testament, they were commanded to observe the Passover on the month Nisan 15. That was the month, Nisan 15. Now, Nisan 15, just like for example, for us, for Christmas, Christmas is always celebrated on what? 25th, right? Now, this year, it was what, Tuesday? This past year? Well, will it be Tuesday this year? No, it'll be a different day, but it's always the 25th. Now, that's the way it is here. Now, I said the 15th. That could have landed on any day. But what Mark tells us here, that it was on the day of preparation, or on Friday. Now, the day of preparation means the day in which they prepared before the Sabbath. You remember Jewish law says you cannot work on the Sabbath. So how are you going to eat? How are you going to cook your meals? How are you going to be ready to do whatever it is you need to do? You have to do it the day before. And so they cook all their meals. They do all their preparations that they need to do for the meal the next day. They do that on Friday because on Saturday, no work. You eat. And so that's why it's called preparation. That's on Friday. Now, if you go back and look at the calendar, there are only 2 years in which Nisan 15 landed on a Friday. And that would have been the year 30 AD or the year 33 AD. And so you can go back, rectify the calendar. You can go back, and those are the only 2 years we have on record where the 15th of Nisan was on a Friday, which means then either Jesus was crucified 30 AD or he was crucified 33 AD. Now, you take your choice, pick your poison, as we say. I say that it was 33 AD, and the reason why I say that, because there are other mentions in Scripture of characters and historical people and events that take place that correlate and rectify the year 33 AD, support the year 33 AD. So that's how we can know. That's how we know when Jesus was crucified and how all this took place. Now, I'm setting all this up because I know you think I'm driving a thumbtack with a sledgehammer. Sometimes I'm guilty of that. But what I want to do is try to set up for you how Jesus is preparing here for his crucifixion. You see, this is not an accident. This is not plan B. Some people who teach and preach premillennialism teach and preach that it is plan B, that now the church age is God's secondary plan and not his primary plan. And all this just speaks in the face of that and says that can't be true, that can't be possible. And so that's why I'm trying to stress this with you here. Now, go back to verse 17. It says, on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread. All right, what day is that? Well, that has to be Thursday. They're in Thursday now, and they're preparing. They're preparing for the Passover. Remember, they counted their days from sunset to sunset the next day. That's how their day didn't go from midnight to midnight. It went from sunset to sunset the next day. So we're preparing for 6 o'clock. Remember, sacrifice was from 3 to 5. You had to be at your meal by 6 o'clock. That's when the day started. So that's what's going on here. This is Thursday when this happens in verse 17. They're preparing for the Passover. Now, to prepare for the Passover, there was a lot of things that had to be done. Number one, you had to find your lamb. Most of the time, the lambs that were slain were family pets. Some of them literally lived in the same home with the family. And like any family pet, those of you who've had pets, you know you can get really attached to them, right? and you can get really close to them. The Lord God in the Old Testament is saying, I want you to offer your lamb. And this lamb was to be someone who's like a pet to you, someone without spot, someone without blemish. And you offer that, and then you eat it. Now, why would God do such a thing? Because he's trying to teach them about how bad sin is. Because sin can bring pain. Sin brings sorrow. Sin brings all this stuff. And they're reminded in that when they offer this precious lamb that they have, grown attached to through the year. And so they had to secure the lamb here. Jesus and his disciples had to secure their lamb for it as well. And then they had to prepare their unleavened bread to get that. And then on the table of unleavened bread, and you have the lamb that's been offered, you have a bowl of salt water. And the bowl of salt water represents the tears that Israel shed in the 400-year bondage in Egypt. And so now that's on the table as well. And so you have that. And then you have as well on the table these bitter herbs. I'm not an herb expert. I know horseradish is a bitter herb, isn't it? Don't know what else. What else would be in that mixture, in that concoction of those bitter herbs, but that had to be. And then that was mixed, it's kind of like a little paste, and it was mixed with hyssop. And hyssop was what was used to spread the blood on the doorpost and lintel of the doors for Passover. And the bitter herbs, of course, was to remind them of the bitterness of slavery and bondage in Egypt. Everything that's on the table represents something about the Passover there. And so they have that. And then they have this sauce they've made up. And the sauce is made up of ground up apples, pomegranates, and dates and nuts. And all that's mixed up in there kind of as a paste as well. And what they would do with that is they would use that as a dip for their unleavened bread. So you take, you couldn't choke down unleavened bread by itself, so they would take that and use it as a dip to eat their unleavened bread with. Of course, that reminded them of the land of promise, the land that they were to go to. And then, in that concoction, in that paste where you dipped your unleavened bread, they had sticks of cinnamon in that. And that was to represent the straw from the bricks that they had made. And that paste also reminded them of the bricks that they had made from the clay. So you had all that. And then on top of that, you had 4 cups of wine. And those 4 cups of wine represented their covenant with God. In Exodus chapter 6, God tells them 4 things. He says, I will bring you out of Egypt, out of the land of bondage. That was the first thing in the covenant. And then he said, I will rid you of your bondage with them. That was the second thing. And then the third thing had to do with, I will redeem you with outstretched hands. That was another part of the covenant of God. And then finally, he says, I will be your God. So those cups represented the covenant that they had with God. Now, go back to verse 17. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, where do you want us to make preparation for you to eat the Passover? So you see, all this has got to be done. That's why they can't just pop in. Somebody says, why didn't they just do this in Bethany? That's where they were staying, because the law commanded that the Passover had to be observed within the confines of Jerusalem. That's why they're doing this. Verse 18, he replied, go into the city to a certain man and tell him the teacher says my appointed time is near. Now, this is where it really gets interesting. They ask him, Lord, where do you want us to celebrate the Passover? Well, we can't do it in Bethany because we got to go to Jerusalem. Not only that, but the Passover had to have at least 10 men to eat the lamb. You could have no less than 10, and no more than 20. That's how it had to be. So here are 2 million people now crowded into the city of Jerusalem, which is roughly twice the size of Lafayette, speaking about the town itself. And so he says, you go into the city, and there he says you will find, and some of you may have a translation that reads, a certain, or mine says a certain man. Does yours say such a man? Is that how some of you read in yours? Yours says certain man? Say such a man? Such a man. Okay, such a man. Now, here's basically what Jesus was saying. Have you ever gotten into conversation with somebody and you're talking about it and you're going to mention someone's name and all of a sudden it just leaves you? And you say, well, what's his name? And they still don't have a clue who you're talking about, but you can see them plainly in your head. Now, that's basically the translation of this. When Jesus says such a man in your translation, or in this one, a certain man, he's not giving us any specific person. He's just saying, go into Jerusalem and find what's his name and tell him we've come to have the Passover at his house. Now that's how it's written in the Greek, like that. He doesn't give a specific name. He doesn't give a specific person. Now, Mark tells us in his gospel that Jesus said to him, I want you to go into the city to a certain man. You'll find Mr. So-and-so. And he's going to be carrying a pitcher of water. You remember that? He's going to be carrying a pitcher of water. Well, 2 million people, and you want me to find somebody carrying a pitcher of water? But now remember this. Custom in the Old, or in this time, it's not Old Testament, no, it is Old Testament. Custom at this time, who carried the water the majority of times? Women. Exactly right. Women carried the water. In case you ladies forgot that. You're supposed to carry the water. Well, when you go into the city and you see a man carrying water, you can pretty well easily identify him. So you go in that city. My time run out? I think it has, hasn't it? Okay. My time's gone. I'm sorry. I didn't have my warning light back there. We'll pick up next week, and I'll try to finish this.